As you heard, Susan Robertson is very much in demand for doing keynotes everywhere, so we're delighted we were able to book her. I think we booked you first, didn't we? We booked you early on. Also, particularly, she's obviously has a strong interest in theory and has always been a leader in theory. I'm personally very interested in this fat versus flat ontology, not just because I'm trying to lose a little bit of my point, but also because I've always been fascinated by critical realism, and I've actually heard about Susan's work. She was 16 years at Bristol. Well, I don't know, but you were known as someone who was developing and promoting critical realism in the social sciences. And I think it's, I hope you've come across this before, but we've all got a lot to learn from this. I think it's really very important and fascinating work, so I very much look forward to that. Susan Robertson was a co-founder of the journal Globalization, Society and Education, and her 16 years at Bristol, you were heading up an important globalization unit. So she's very much known for her work in developing interdisciplinary theory, but it's also very exciting for us because she's the incoming head of school, so it's great here at Cambridge to have or dean, I think. Yeah, dean. The dean.
No, nothing is grandiose as that.
What do they call the head of faculty here? Well, anyway, very important person.
The one that would get away.
So it's really good for us that we have somebody so interested in developing educational theory in a position of influence. I think I'll just leave it there and pass you on to Susan. And thank you very much for coming, Susan. And we're all looking forward to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you also to the organising committee. You've been quite superb over the months actually leading into this conference. It was wonderful to get this invitation, and might I actually say I'm a kind of a user of critical realism in that sense, searching around for the kind of theories that might, or meta-theory in this particular case, that might support the kind of work that over the longer haul I've been engaged with colleagues and with research students. This has always been a meta kind of theoretical position that I've kind of come back to and found particularly useful. So, without further ado, explaining education events and experiences, making the case for a fat versus flat ontology. I'm being rather playful here around fatness versus flatness, but not particularly. And I want to, let me just get my devices here. I want to kind of give you an overview of where I'm going. I want to leave enough time to open some questions. I realise I have the privileged space today to set some of the conversations running, which I hope to do by the conclusion. And hopefully, if it's been interesting enough, some of those conversations will get picked up in the various sessions, and Martin Hammersley will be putting a counter position tomorrow, a case for epistemology over ontology. So I want to say something about teaching and learning events and experiences in search of robust explanation. So you have the first clue as to what critical realism is sort of up to. It's to some extent claiming some kind of privileged position around offering or pushing us to develop explanations as to what's actually going on. Then I want to, and you can see this is slightly straw person, but to suggest that in the hands of some paradigms, but particularly I want to kind of point to policymakers. They work with incredibly flat ontologies as to what's actually going on, whether it's RCTs, evidence-based policy and so on. And I want to end up ultimately with this view about a fat ontology, is to say that really what it also does take us back to, if we're serious about thinking about the worlds of education as being very much more fluid, very dynamic. We aren't always easily able to identify regularities that hold for all time, that kind of thing. And then that kind of takes us back to, I think, what all of you in this room are concerned about, which is actually the capabilities of people who work in education, teachers of various kinds, all kinds, whether in schools or universities, that then the onus to some extent is on them to actually begin the work of, as researchers themselves, though they might be actually frontline teachers, thinking about what it would actually mean for them to begin to develop explanations of complex social phenomena going on in classrooms, in teaching and learning settings, spaces that are actually governed by quite complex technologies, and so on. I want to end with some thoughts then around if we are thinking about explanations, then this puts the weight much more on what Swedberg talks about, not just theory, but theorising. So that what we ought to be aiming to do is not just being rather lazy with the theoretical resources that we have, but using those theories, and as Bernstein would encourage you to do, to go into the field, his so-called language of description, but actually to re-describe based on what is it that we see out there. Always open to the fact that social worlds are changing, phenomena is moving in interesting and important ways and having important effects on teachers, learners, if the effects of what's actually going on. So that's the kind of journey, so let's get started. So education researchers are puzzling over a whole range of things. And I could actually start with a set of education questions that my colleague Roger Dale and myself, but particularly Roger, has developed over time. Because these education questions, and they go something like this. So we can actually start and we can actually say, who learns what? And we can, or who teaches what? But then we need to begin to complicate this puzzle. Okay? Who learns what, where, how, under what circumstances, and so on. Then go to another step, which is again a set of questions, which isn't necessarily easily revealed in just looking at what we see in front of us. How are these things governed? Now, it's quite difficult to see the activities of the governors, whether it's world-class rankings or it may well be literacy time and so on. But these are really important questions to begin to reveal the complexities of any particular situation at any particular point in time. We're also looking at effects, and we know that those effects, when learners feel that they're valued, that plays back into how they see themselves in the world and their engagement with education tasks, with teachers and so on. So their sense of themselves as a learner begins to alter. But it may not be a stable moment. For some students it perhaps is. It may differ depending upon whether they encounter other teachers, classroom mates, find themselves in dramatically different circumstances. For example, you could think of radical disruptions. Refugee students' life might have been going along in a lane that was kind of fairly predictable. They may well have been high achievers, and suddenly, let's take the case of Syria, their world implodes. They find themselves actually isolated, relocated in different places. Suddenly the kind of cultural capital that they might have had in one place isn't actually able to be exchanged in any way in another place. And in using that example, I'm actually referring to a doctoral student that I supervised whose fortunes as a high-flying PhD student went from Syria to University of Bristol. Her money supply gets chopped off. The family's in different places between Lebanon and Dubai, and suddenly she has no resources at all, and her capacity even to begin to complete her PhD. Progress was problematic, and yet if we actually said progress was problematic, the immigration authorities would have deported her and back immediately into a situation that was imploding. So you can see a very a sense that a world was quite predictable for this learner. Suddenly, with a series of quite dramatic events, her life has changed quite considerably. So there's a whole set of dynamics I've just described that we would actually need to begin to take into account to describe the quite differently situated in time and space and place teaching or the learning trajectory for this particular student. Take another puzzle, and it's one I'll speak much more to at the ECR conference, and this idea of world-class universities or league tables and so on. And I'll come back to this one because essentially it does for me highlight the limitations of what I would describe as a flat ontology and not a fat ontology. Okay. And the story goes something like this, that now we've got the OECD, it's specialised in data collection and big data collection, and what is it doing? It's governing by numbers. Okay. Now I'm going to suggest that that really doesn't tell us very much at all about how the OECD and its use of big data is governing in the contemporary period. So I want to kind of hold that there. And those writers, many of them my colleagues, Soteria Grek, Bob Lingard and others, if you comb their texts very closely, you'll discover that it is actually simply an assertion that it's governing by numbers. But the question we would want to pose of this is, well, the OECD has always gathered numbers, and over a long period of time, ever since the beginning of the OECD. So what is different now? The state has always gathered numbers, right back into the 1800s, and the French state has statistics, the collection of numbers and so on. So again, the alert here is that kind of very flat kind of explanation really doesn't help us understand why is it now and how that the OECD has managed to become the premier governor, as it were, and actually has many countries around the world signing up and using the PISA data, the TELUS data, and there's many now data sets, and essentially with the Andreas Schleich kind of arguing that if you don't have data, all you have are beliefs or opinions. So I'm problematizing some of the ways in which I think some of my colleagues, I could even look at the kind of network analysis that people like Stephen Ball have been doing. Okay, so we have a mapping of a network, but how does that network work? Who gets privilege because of the way that network is working? Where is power in that network? And so now again you can begin to see that what I think would be part of a fatter set of explanations would be to see that power is always involved in our social relations in some way, in our various kinds of exchanges, and most definitely know that in relation to teaching and learning relationships, the relationships between schools and governing agencies or bureaus and so on. So somehow we need a theory of power, and we very likely will see that there are unequal outcomes for individuals. Okay, so this is the effects. We do see, for example, hotspots and so-called hotspots and cold spots, which is actually what the government has described with this kind of ailing social mobility for particular groups. But funnily enough, if you look at the social mobility literature, what you'll begin to see is almost schools side by side, also working with similar kinds of populations, and yet we see quite different outcomes or effects in those schools for different pupils. So the question of what's going on, typically the response has been, well, let's take the head teacher because that's what school effectiveness tells us, and you pop them in. But that actually doesn't make any difference. So something more is actually going on other than what we can see, and what some of the theories that we're using are actually helping us kind of identify. My sense is that the policymakers actually do really prefer, we can see this with RCTs, this idea that you can actually take a highly controlled experiment with the RCTs, hold all of the variables or hold the particular variables, give a treatment, and then suddenly, wacko, we've actually been able to identify the variable. But actually, mostly, there are interactions amongst different kinds of social phenomena. So it's not possible simply to take and close this space, run a controlled experiment, and then put this back into the social world, and not think that actually it won't simply just repeat what it is that we see with RCTs. So one criticism then of the RCTs is that though the government's actually here in the UK putting a great deal of money into that, the Department of International Development prefers the use of randomised control trials. Essentially we have a population, we randomly choose two groups, give one a treatment and another, and we're able to potentially identify the specific variable that will actually make a difference here. But essentially we have kind of a conjunction of causality. We don't really have an explanation here on our hands as to actually what's going on. So it's really a causal. We can see there's an effort to suggest there are causal links between these two things. But we would actually want more than that. We would actually want an explanation as to how these things are actually working. On the other hand, we might look at interpretivism, but it makes no claim, and likely Martin won't tomorrow, to kind of an ontological kind of stance. It doesn't want to, as part of the way in which it's looking at the social world, move toward explanation. It sits out there and worries a lot about how we make sense of the world, broadly social constructivism. Now, the issue here, it seems to me, if we begin to run these side by side, is that one is, sorry, it's moved a little bit, but on one side we have a problem of, a flat ontology, and on the other side we have what I would describe it's ontologically light. In other words, there are no declarations of presuppositions about how the world might actually work. Do we see individuals as atomized elements in the world, or do we actually take a view that there are important social relations, asymmetrical social relations that we find ourselves in, and these are incredibly important for how things actually happen, social powers in the world. So, on the one hand, we'll actually have a world that presumes, if we're taking realism, that the world exists, and here we're looking at positivism, independently of our knowledge of it. And this is where critical realism does share the same kinds of presuppositions as the positivists. So we therefore, if that is the case, can get our account of the world wrong. In other words, if we're puzzling over a world, we're attempting to generate explanations in the case of critical realists, as opposed to, let's say, a more strong determinist account, two variables and one is causal of the other. So in this case, what we have for the positivists is looking for law-like principles, or the idea of the covering law. If we can identify these things, they hold for all time, as it were. Now, what's been interesting for me, thinking about that kind of set of propositions, is I've been working quite a lot with Basil Bernstein's work. And for any of you who might know Bernstein, he's quite an important, very difficult to read sociologist. Nevertheless, it should not put us off from reading Bernstein. But Bernstein, like Bourdieu, who was his contemporary, both of them actually had big egos, so neither wanted to recognise that each of them were up to the same kind of thing, trying to generate more complex or concepts that actually helped us to explain the ways in which we developed, in the case of Bernstein, what he would call a pedagogic identity. But what's important for thinking beyond, let's say, a more, not that Bernstein would say this, I definitely would not put him here, he's definitely, probably, likely sitting in and amongst the critical realists, even though he wouldn't describe himself as such. But what he was always pushing you to do is to see that actually our social worlds do change, and though we can actually begin to develop concepts that push themselves into larger kind of bigger explanations of what was actually going on, it was really important for social theorists to work with this changed world, to go out into the field, and Bernstein would push you to go out into the field,
and not simply just put what I call kind of the hat stand kind of approach on. So you put this hat on, it's this theory, and now I go out and I find what that theory is pushing me to go out and find. In the case of Bernstein, much of his writing took place, and the work of many of the students who were doing the empirical work took place in the 80s and 90s to the mid-90s, and he died in the early 2000s. When you take a look at Bernstein's conceptual grammar, what's very apparent is that that conceptual grammar works very nicely if you make the assumption that the state is pretty much the only provider of education. And that actually he has a language that then talks about the pedagogical recontextualizing field, so that's one power dynamic going on in schools. And on the other hand, the official recontextualizing field, another power dynamic. But actually, if you are living here in the UK, there is the presence of a very significant, but not yet identified by Bernstein, and it would be what I would call the commercial recontextualizing field. Now, I wasn't able to talk to Basil about this, but and it would have been really quite exciting. But it would be in the spirit of the work that Bernstein is doing that what we're actually doing is thinking with theory into the field. That field is changing a very dynamic set of social circumstances, social relations, social powers that are being activated. Which means that what we have to do is we're not looking for governing laws that hold for all time. That's not possible. What we are also attentive to, oh my goodness, is, let me just go back out. Sorry, where's... No, I just need, sorry, I'll just be too quickly with this. Thanks, Peter. I'll keep going. So you can see if we're running down here is that, thank you very much. It's hugely important that we're able to understand time-space sociality in context, in geohistorical context, as it were. And we would want a sense, and for Doug Pauper, who writes about critical realism, I mean, lots of things he would say is, these things are common sense. We never describe ourselves as not having agency. We assume a learner actually has agency. So why are we too easily drawn to theories where actually there's an underdeveloped theory of agency? One example. Another example for Pauper would be, why is it that we're too drawn to thinking about subjectivities and identities when we actually think about ourselves as persons and having personhood? And so there would be some scope for actually beginning to think differently about the kind of language. On the other hand, if we moved to this side, what I describe as ontologically light, you either, and this is a presupposition, okay, if there's no world beyond the world that we actually know, okay, you can believe that, but actually that doesn't mean to say that if you don't know about poverty, it doesn't exist. If you don't know about other things happening in the world, what it would feel like to live in the situation that my Syrian student kind of experienced, it doesn't mean to say that her world wasn't actually real. In other words, by denying a world beyond what is it that we know, it seems to me that what we actually do deny is a sense of a bigger social world beyond the limitations of our experience of it. So, let me just move on. So I'm really going to make then a case for critical realism. And here are the key presuppositions. It's a meta-theoretical approach. In other words, it isn't a theory. It's making explicit presuppositions about how it thinks the world works. And if Doug Pauper was standing here, and there's a lovely book that he's written in 2015, he would actually argue, although not all critical realists would agree with him, that critical realism can live with many different methods that it would include regression analysis. Okay. The point, though, let's say using regression analysis, is that it is simply a data point. It's not an explanation. So you could use the results of your regression analysis, but it would be to treat it rather differently. So it can do, as Tony Lawson says, it can do a great deal of under-labouring. It's making clear our presuppositions. So it's a meta-theoretical and a philosophical approach. It guides our research paradigms and our puzzlings over social problems, objects, and events. It assumes, and this is really important, that the social world is open. So unlike the RCT, which kind of closes the randomised research trial, closes off the social world, it seals it off, social worlds are open. We might see things, patterns, we might have ways of describing the world like social mobility, but do we always know the causal mechanisms at work from one era to the next in relation to social mobility? And that would be really important to a critical realist, because essentially from one decade to another there may well be rather different dynamics at work. An interesting case, I was just looking with one of my doctoral students at some of the evidence from the Sutton Trust, and interestingly, Afro-Caribbean boys aren't now the group that are the most disadvantaged. Okay, so there have clearly been policies and programs which the ethnic minority programs that have been put into place that may well have, we don't necessarily know this, but it would seem to be in the case of the UK, had consequences, positive effects that have actually meant that they're now no longer the most disadvantaged category in terms of forms of social mobility. So it assumes that the social world is open and not closed, and it makes a series of really important presuppositions about the nature of knowledge. So that there are objects, events, objects, or an ensemble, that are intransitive. They are the object of our science. So we're actually looking at something like the way global rankings might work. So we can see those, and we then move to, and we have then a set of theories about how they work. Unlike the natural world, essentially that operates fairly well with a single hermeneutic, there is a double hermeneutic at work. And we can see that. In other words, when we label categories conceptually, some of those categories actually do have effects on the object. We can actually also see that. So this is where, if we label children as difficult, lazy, underachievers, and so on, well, we do actually know that these have effects. But that doesn't mean to say that essentially, separate from our labelling, those objects, the objects of our science, don't exist separately from the categories that we actually use. If that was the case, essentially we could erase a category and essentially the object would actually disappear. But we still actually have the phenomena in front of us, which would be some schools do better than others, some pupils do better than others, some teachers are better than others. Okay, and again, what we need to know is what's actually going on. So this is incredibly important because this is the level at which the critical realists are actually beginning their work. Second key set of propositions is that there is a stratified social ontology. So essentially, if we work from the bottom up, the empirical is the domain of experience. Okay. And that's to a large extent where the interpretativists are actually, we're interested in experience, but experience can only reveal so much of actually what's going on. In other words, experiences are the effects or the outcomes of other dynamics at work. If we go upwards, then the action refers to what happens when those powers are activated to do what they do and what eventuates when they do. Here's the important move. At the level of the real, those objects, events, the ensemble, have social powers. They may not be activated. And I'll give you an example, go back to the OECD PISA and rankings. But they are there. And they may be activated in different contexts and in different ways. So if we look at the global, or the PISA rankings, for example, the French one year decided that they were not going to accept the PISA rankings, and there were interesting reasons. There was an election coming up, and so on. So in France, for example, despite the fact that the French, and I don't even think their figures were included, but it had no effect on what was going on in France. But if you look at the case of Germany, when it received the so-called PISA shock, it didn't work on all of the different member countries in quite the same way. Now, if we were to go closer in and look at what was happening, we might begin to think about how the German education system was governed. And it is governed at the subnational level and not at the national level. So constitutional authority, like in countries like Australia and Canada, is subnational. It sits with the states, and then you've got the national above that. And to some extent, this would be my explanation, some of the consequences, some of the shock in the case of what activates the causal mechanisms in the case of Germany is that the federal government was increasingly wanting to come in and have something to say about subnational education system. That's not all there was to say, because as we'll see a little bit later, there are some other mechanisms at work with the way in which these global rankings actually work, PISA, university rankings and so on. But particularly tied to the way in which shame and guilt and acclaim, fame and so on are actually part of the way in which that actually works. So the real, is whatever exists, be it natural or social, and it's the realm of objects, their structures and powers. So here we're attributing to events, objects, latent but causal powers that can be activated under particular kinds of conditions. So we then can see that the world is actually characterised by emergence. And so this is where we actually get a much more dynamic world. An RCT at a particular moment in time, even though it's kind of hermeneutically sealed, when the world changes quite dramatically, you can actually see that, in fact, that may offer us a completely inappropriate set of explanations there. It might be a data point for the critical realists, but a data point in a particular period of time. Following Marx, essentially all phenomena, and here social phenomena, student behaviour, for example, can be tied right back into thinking at the level of the biological, and we can see that that is actually the case. So the social world is that complex combination of the chemical, physical states, along with relations with others, institutions and systems. So these are really complex sets of possibilities and emergences, which actually you can see why it is that, though the OECD is often really furious that we can't just find the best evidence and that holds for all time, but essentially the best evidence is always evidence in context. And you can see where you might go with that is that if essentially the world is changing and we have knowledge about a particular point in time, what we would always be wanting to do is to update those explanations in relation to these contexts that might be different and changing. So beyond patterns of events, so this is Andrew Sayer who's talking here, who in my view is one of the really, along with Margaret Archer, Roy Bhaskar, but Sayer's writings are very kind of accessible to any kind of student and a person like myself who's using critical realism rather than advancing critical realism as a kind of a theoretical position that would be much more, much beyond what I'm able to do. But he says this is more to the world of patterns of events. Okay? And you can see, to some extent, they would be somewhat critical of Bourdieu's work, where we can kind of see patterns of events there. Events arise from the mechanisms that derive from the structures of objects, and they take place in geohistorical contexts. So again, always critical realist is wanting to be attentive to the context and to the mechanisms that are at work in that context, which we may see similar kinds of outcomes. If you lose your job, but there might be different reasons for losing your job, as Sayer would actually say. So it does then work with a theory of causation here. So causal powers actually reside in the objects at the level of the real, and these objects are also part of structures. So a whole myriad of different kinds of structures and relations. Teacher-learner, these are objective relations, but they structure the encounters in quite important ways. We can say that structures have causal powers which can be activated, and here now we're left with the job of the researcher is to explain, the job of the researcher in explaining is to discover the nature of the structure and object that the object possesses, what mechanisms, what social powers. So this requires thick description, it requires explanations, and it requires, I think, rival explanations. One way we might think about it is this, and it seems to me that this is where very healthy debates in conferences like this then begin to emerge. Rival explanations rather than, and it was something that Bernstein was very critical of, what he called singulars. You know, academic careers to be made where you specialise in one specific kind of claim and it kind of almost overclaims, and again I'd probably say some of the network analysis work as a kind of total theory of everything. Healthy debate in the academy is actually where we're working with rival explanations in relation to what we might think are similar kinds of mechanisms, causal mechanisms in context. So does this mean that interpretations or our social constructions are not important? No, it doesn't. It does mean that social phenomena is intrinsically meaningful, and also meaning is constitutive of objects. It also does mean that we're interested too in actors' intentions, and their interests are part of the causal powers of the causal properties. But it does mean that actually what that the critical realist you're actually wanting to do is to go looking for, so we're interested in meaning, we make sense of the world, we actually generate concepts to make sense of the world, but nevertheless there's something more to be said here. So let's come back to the global rankings and their causal mechanisms. And I'm getting toward the end. Is it governing by numbers? Okay, so we can see that. We can rank them 1 to 15 and so on. In my own writing, I've been much more critical of this quite flat ontology, governing by numbers. And if you open up and look at global rankings, what you begin to see is verticality has causal effects. And real causal, material effects for institutions, for example. Going up or down actually means students do and don't come. It generates vibrations right across the institution. My previous institution and the Vice-Chancellor in Bristol, Bristol's global rankings have begun to slip, and it would have actually hastened the departure of the Vice Chancellor, the real material effects. Another one here, which has causal consequences, is the way in which these rankings come out, and I'm going to the launch of one in Central Asia, leaving tomorrow, is that it's always on the temporal horizon. So the social powers of temporality are being mobilised. You're always made to be attentive to it. And it works very much with political cycles. So politicians who will be invited to many of these different launches, affect and emotion. The way in which these global rankings can mobilise this sense, in the case of Germany, of shame, because they were so proud of their education system. And in effect, really, and this was the other causal mechanism at work, was that the OECD had shifted away from toward competences. Germany didn't have a system of education that was driven by a competency-based model. Once you change the rules of the game, essentially you can begin to see that Germany, in this new set of rules of the game, is not going to operate in quite as effective in that. So these other modalities of power, social powers, help move us a long way forward, a lot further forward than simply governing by numbers. So we have an object and a set of events, and we can see that they've actually got causal properties. And the interesting question here is actually why have these kind of global rankings become so powerful now, and it's in part lots of different reasons that would vary from country to country, institution to institution, and so on. And so you would actually want to be looking across different countries and across different institutions. I'll just move over that. Much of the work that I've done with Roger more recently has drawn on a critical realist approach here. So attempting to move beyond practice and experience and insisting what would be described as an actualist explanation, education politics, what we see actually happening, and then looking at what Roger would call the politics of education. But essentially, these are mechanisms, causal mechanisms in context which actually have effects. In our own work, what we've done is to try and draw down into the real, as it were, the causal consequences of the cultural. And here we're thinking of the way in which Raymond Williams' structures of feeling, for example, are part of the very deep way in which it would seem to me the cultural itself isn't simply just epiphenomena and tied just to meanings, but actually has causal consequences. So, drawing these things to a conclusion, Richard Swedberg's then asking us if we're placing the weight, if we accept the presuppositions that there's more to the world and more that's going on, simply our experience of it, and so on, and the events that we actually kind of can see. If the weight then sits on explanations, Swedberg's argument is that what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to do a lot more work on not just using theory, but theorising. So if we're to offer thick description, identify causal mechanisms, compare rival and existing theories and derive rival explanations, then his view is that what we need to do is to water down to some extent, this preoccupation with methods, which I would even say characterises our doctoral program here at Cambridge, and that we actually do a lot more work on theorising, not just using theory, but theorising. If we accept that the social world is much more dynamic and changing, if we accept that the causal mechanisms in particular context, from different school to school and so on, require our explanation, then what we then need to do is to actually, let's say, take the conceptual grammar of people like Bernstein, Bourdieu and others, but actually put them to work, to theorise with them, not simply just to adopt them in some rather lazy way, habitus for all time, cultural capital for all time, and so on. And that's quite a challenge, I think, because it's a challenge for the academy. Our challenge in the academy, which I think we would accept, is that actually what we need them to do is to work much harder on theorising. And what this doesn't mean is coming up with this grandiose theory for all time, but what it does mean is being also prepared not to tag your academic reputation to this one theory for all time, but to actually see, like Bernstein wanted us to do, is that our theories are always going into the field and being prepared to quote, be surprised with what he called announcements. So back to the policymakers, researchers and teachers. If it insists on critical realism, would then insist on being evidence-informed, not evidence-based. We can use our accounts of what's going on. But as social settings by definition are open, emergent and so on, then it seems to me that what we're always wanting to do is we're constantly on our mettle, so to speak. This suggests that we equip those close, and I think this is a really interesting challenge for the teaching profession, for us as teachers, but also the teaching profession, that those closest to the social settings that need explanation will require teachers to feel confident about themselves as researchers, confident about themselves using theories to actually think about what's actually going on. As opposed to, as it seems to me is what's happening, is we're stripping away quite a lot of that professional knowledge and confidence and arming them with this potentially feel-good, secure RCT finding, but actually that's a finding that exists in a world that is highly controlled, not the social settings of classrooms. So I'll leave it there, a critical realist account, and I would be very interested to hear tomorrow's keynote address, which we could potentially account for. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. I'm sure that people will have been stimulated by that account with some responsive voices. Any questions from the audience? We've got about 15 minutes, I think, if that's right. The break's at 10:30, and so we'll just have a few minutes of questions. We've got an instant one from Jack White. Let's go with that.
I was just fascinated by the last point, which I really agree with about the need for theorising. But I'm aware of this issue I've got about educational theorising, because 50 years ago, Bernstein was lecturing from within the discipline's approach to educational theory. And in that approach, my practical principles that I use as a teacher were viewed as, at best, pragmatic maxims that had a first loose and woolly superficial justification in practice, that in any rationally developed theory would be replaced by the theories from the disciplines. Now, I'm just wondering, in terms of your notion of education research, which in the last one slide you showed us, that if you're going back into that notion of the disciplines, and in particular the sociology, which actually eliminates the practical principles of educational theorising, which this dialogue of the SIG is actually trying to promote educational dialogue. And I just wonder if you're almost aware of that kind of tension.
No, I would. So, in talking about social worlds, I don't think sociology at all has the privileged right to only speak about social worlds. For me, the social world is a real world, as it were, in that sense. That geographers, space is social. Our learning theories are actually thinking about individuals. So I would actually I'm not making a case for, let's say, the discipline of sociology. I'm actually making a case for all of the different disciplines, for example, to be able to put on the table their different theoretical resources.
Yes, that was my point.
Yeah.
But in doing that, I'm asking whether you're eliminating from the discourse, as Susan Sanders talks about in the work on the business side, you're eliminating the very practical principles that are used to explain educational influences in learning, and in particular, educational influences. Because that's my point. That is exactly what you're doing. In terms of bringing all of the theories from the disciplines to bear, which is what they did 50 years ago. They brought all the disciplines to bear, believing that this would explain educational influences in learning.
Okay, so what would you see as an educational? So it seems to me the problems I puzzle over, for example, using Bernstein, would be things like how do we learn to be who we are, a pedagogical identity.
Sorry, I don't want to hog this, but it's just using Bernstein's notion of recontextualization. You take the practical embodied knowledge of the educator and you recontextualize that knowledge into the academy, and by so doing, you bring in a totally different dialogue in epistemology and ontology. But I don't want to hog this, as I say.
Well, I think it's an interesting issue, it's a good question. But perhaps you can think about it.
Yeah.
Is it, well, any responses?
Could I just pick up, I know Santos has worked really well, and what he's talking about is this effort, and he would talk about an ecology of knowledges.
Yeah.
And so what would be the unpromising path, for example, would be where someone like myself would claim this is the only way of knowing. Yeah. Whereas what he would be wanting to do in an ecology of knowledges would be to open up different ways of seeing, thinking the world.
Yeah, but he would be arguing, I think, that what you're doing is actually reconstructing business just through your use of the logic and the language of the Western academy, which you're doing very well. And I really enjoy it, and you're doing that very well. But
Well, I think we should all think about that. They're really interesting issues. A little bit about fundamental and applied research. Farah, did you have a?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is just down to time, but I was wondering. I didn't hear anything in your presentation, given your background on critical pedagogy, social justice issues, Southern theory, and how that might contribute to moving from a flat to a fact ontology.
So that's heading in a similar kind of, well, a lot would depend on what is it you want to explain, wouldn't it? What things you're actually puzzling over. So things I've puzzled a lot over would be something like the rampant privatising that's going on in education systems there. And it would be to then begin to say this is relational, all governance frameworks and social justice outcomes. In that, they are strategically selected for some interests over others, for instance. Now, that seems to me that's a relational way of thinking, because in a sense, governing frameworks in education systems, typically the way most of them, not all settings, there'd be governing frameworks that are looking not to generate new kinds of hierarchies, but they may well be deliberately aiming to interact with, engage with a very different kind of cosmology. And I'm here thinking about the Māori University, the Wānanga, deliberately engaging with Māori knowledges, for example, and so on. But to the extent that actually if I'm looking at the way in which, let's say, choice theories are actually working and privatisation processes are actually working, they very clearly, if we look at the outcomes, there's essentially a group that get left behind routinely 20%, for example. So I'd see it as quite sympathetic, this kind of approach. But
what space would there be in a critical realist approach for Maori Indigenous knowledge? Sorry.
It would potentially, if I was looking at that, it would and again go back to New Zealand where I was for 4 years, it would generate different kinds of outcomes, okay, in the social setting. So in the case of the Indigenous University, they've got the Kura Māori schools and so on. What does it mean actually for individuals to be educated in Māori language in the context of New Zealand? And what are the outcomes for particular? And they're not necessarily straightforward in the sense that there's a raging debate going on in New Zealand about, if you only educate in the Indigenous language, much like Bolivia, then one of this is the age-old issue. What then happens if you want to participate in an English language mediated world?
And there's a question.
Sami Paavola, University Helsinki. I'm also asking about this, do you see any restrictions on critical realism? Because I'm also, any restrictions in the approach of critical realism, because I agree from my own point of view that we are working somewhere in between this kind of interpretivism and this kind of covering law realism. But there are many options there, I think, also if you are taking that kind of an approach. And critical realism, there are concepts like causes, also mechanisms, explanations, and I see then that they are a bit more on this kind of covering law idea still, that real things are somewhere outside us. And I'm taking more like practice-based approach, and then these things, what you describe on actual, what is actual, it's more what many practice-based approaches are saying, that it's not outside. We are not looking at mechanism and causes, but how things are, how we can intervene on things and so on. So do you see that critical realism is kind of it restricts also, it's kind of it sees world in a certain way, and maybe some other things are kind of outside of that.
Okay, so it refuses the covering law, actually.
Yes,
essentially,
but it's a bit similar if you are talking about mechanisms and causes.
So it's
quite close to that.
Except that the covering law actually kind of freezes the world. I mean, essentially it says that there's causal mechanisms, and the job of the researchers is to go out and discover them, a bit like the natural world. Critical realists, essentially, there are causal mechanisms, but from any one, I mean, these are much more, we can't necessarily predict what the outcomes are from complex ensembles of mechanisms at work. We sometimes might see similar effects, but actually, if we even look at the global rankings or the OECD, the way it works now as opposed to the way it worked, perhaps even 2 decades ago, even though it's working with numbers, we can see those things are actually working rather differently, and so our job would be to. But my sense is that we're always explaining. We offer explanations all the time. We're not just looking at practice, we're using abstract concepts all the time. Power, even. So it feels more like common sense to me, as opposed to, we can see regularities in the world, or on the other side, all there is to know is what we can experience the world ourselves.
Perhaps there's one last question, short question, presumably, from Adele, and then we'll go.
Thank you very much for your talk. And perhaps at this point, understanding better what you mean by explanation, by explaining would help.
So our explanations are now in theory informed, but it's actually what's going on here. What are the causal mechanisms at work, or the causal powers at work? So the example I'll go back to was where I was actually looking at governing by numbers. So I'd say that an explanation governing by numbers, simply that explanation. I would want to put a rival explanation up to actually look at other social powers at work, temporalities, so the way in which space is actually quite strategically used. When we organise space vertically and we actually attribute particular value to 1 versus 2 versus 3 and so on. The fact that actually 1, 2 and 3 might actually be almost equivalent, but they're actually distinguished as, because they're arranged vertically, that verticality actually has causal effects on how we not just read those things, 1, 2, 3, but there are material consequences. There are real effects if you're sliding down and you're suddenly 37 and you were 15 and so on. So, which would actually also kick into what we would then see, what's the institution actually doing about that. So we can actually see the consequences of those effects from the institution's response to or the country's response to where we're located.
Well, and better leave it there, because we've got a break to go to, but thank you very much for priming the conference with these stimulating ideas. As you say, I think we're going to get a sort of a different view tomorrow from Martin, which is all to the good, isn't it? And I do think, I hope that these ideas have been stimulating and fascinating for you, as they are for me. And I do find them very interesting and very thoughtful, and I hope we can continue to discuss them throughout the conference. And I'll feedback Susan on what we hear. It's my pleasure to present you with a small gift that's been produced by the local organising committee. It's the work of a local artist, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.